Good evening, and welcome to tonight's clinical seminar on what is fear of harm. For those of you who are new to CMHRC, I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Elizabeth Errico, and I'm the Executive Director and founder of Children's Mental Health Resource Center. Our mission is to provide guidance and resources for the early identification and management of mood disorders, bipolar disorder, and its newly identified phenotype that has been dubbed FOH, or fear of harm, by its researchers. In order to fulfill this mission, we provide a number of programs and services to mental health care providers, physical health care providers, and families living with mental illness in childhood. Some of those programs and services include our palliative parenting classes, which are conducted face-to-face via Zoom online or in our on-demand self-guided video course. We have our ketogenic therapy in action program, which is currently a pilot research study examining the effectiveness of ketogenic therapy in the treatment of bipolar disorder in children ages 6 to 17. We also have our custom designed app that we created called the CMHRC Toolkit, which allows families to track symptoms, diagnoses, medication trials, and their child's mood on a daily basis. We also have a version of this app for providers so that they can have their family clients share with them their data in real time, so you know exactly how your clients and patients are doing when they are not in your office. We also have our high touch personalized support services, which we call our Wayfinder services. And these include diagnostic consultation support for families as well as providers, where we provide in depth holistic diagnostic research in order to help verify diagnoses and to explain to families the reality of living with those diagnoses. We also have our community advocacy and consultation program, our interdisciplinary professional discussion groups. We have our monthly book club, and of course, our free webinar and clinical seminars every month, and several other services and programs that you can find on our website. It's 2025, and all year long, we are running a special fundraiser. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we depend on the generosity of our community in order to be able to fund our programs and services, to keep them at below market rates, and to keep as many programs as possible free of charge. So we're asking everyone in our community to consider a gift this year of giving 25 in 2025, either as a one-time gift or as a recurring monthly donation of $25 a month, which significantly helps us plan and remain agile in the face of changing community needs. This QR code, which I will show again at the end, is a quick and easy way for you to make a contribution on our safe and secure fundraising platform, or you can go to our website, cmhrc.org/donate, and make a gift. We also have right now running our spring fundraiser for in honor of May, which is Children's Mental Health Awareness Month. So any contribution you can give would be deeply appreciated by us and our community. Now, tonight, our learning objectives include understanding how the FOH phenotype was identified, understanding how FOH's symptoms present and how to identify them, how to understand and differentiate FOH from other diagnoses, and understanding the identified treatments that have been outlined by the researchers who first identified the FOH diagnosis. So, where we're going to start is with the elephant in the room, the same question that we get asked over and over again, which is about the name fear of harm. It's confusing as the name of a mental health disorder because being afraid is a normal human emotion. As people say, it is a normal human experience to be afraid of being harmed. And if that's what you're thinking, then I want you to know that you're right. I get it. I didn't name this disorder. I agree with you. It is unusual and can be somewhat confusing. But the truth is that the term fear of harm, when used in this particular context, isn't referring to any sort of normal human experience of being afraid of being harmed. It's a shorthand term that was used by the researchers who first identified this new phenotype of bipolar. Um, and it is based on the fact that being afraid of being harmed to an exaggerated and pathological degree is one of the hallmark symptoms. Now, this disorder impacts roughly 1/3 of all people who have bipolar disorder, children, adolescents, as well as adults. And we're going to spend the next 90 minutes taking a deep dive into this disorder that may or may not yet have an official name because it is continuing to be researched. So there are several names that have been used over the past 15 years in published papers to refer to this disorder. But the phenotype will not receive an official name until it is submitted to the DSM committees for review, which it has not, again, because it is still being researched. So in the meantime, in order to have sort of a quick reference, the researchers dubbed this disorder fear of harm after, as I mentioned, one of its hallmark symptoms. It was one of two most important characteristics, which was a pervasive and extreme fear that resulted in hypervigilance and a fight or flight response focused on the idea that some real or perceived harm would come to that individual or would come to someone that they loved. It is more than regular anxiety. It's not based on trauma, and we'll talk about it in a lot more detail throughout the presentation. But for now, what you need to know is that fear of harm is extensive and it's debilitating. So this is why researchers dubbed the disorder fear of harm, which became known as FOH. That name has become relatively well known, and so researchers are continuing to use that terminology at this point to refer to the disorder. But it is a lot more than simply fear of being harmed. As we go through the presentation tonight, I am confident there will be questions, comments, things that our audience would like to bring to our attention. Please feel free to put all of your comments and questions into the Q&A. When we're finished with tonight's presentation, we will turn the cameras off and have a private Q&A session where we are able to address the concerns of our audience. If you are watching this as a recording, please consider attending one of our live events so that you too can participate in that Q&A at the end. Now, the researchers themselves have described this process of naming as a reflection of their own evolving and increasing understanding of the disorder, its causes, and its symptoms. Initially, their research showed that the disorder's primary characteristic was this extreme fear of harm. Thus, it was named the fear of harm phenotype. But as time went on and the research continued, biological factors that underlie the disorder became more clear, and they realized that the disorder was even more complex than the name fear of harm suggested, and fear of harm wasn't going to cover all of those dimensions. But that initial name, fear of harm, has stuck around as shorthand for the disorder, and it is confusing for some people. Now, I want to take a moment to just be totally clear that when we talk about fear of harm in regards to this disorder, that it is not a case of adult subjectivity diminishing the legitimate fears of a child. This is a question that comes up all the time when we talk about fear of harm. How can you dismiss a child's fears? They may be based on real life experiences that they have every reason to justifiably be afraid of. We completely agree with you. And what I would like to do is to try to reassure our audience that the diagnostic process for FOH absolutely and completely takes into consideration an examination of the child's life, their life circumstances, their life, where they live, who they live with, what their individualized experiences are, specifically in order to ensure that we are not ignoring or minimizing in any way the lived experience of that child, teen, or adult. So it has nothing to do with gaslighting someone out of believing their perceptions. It is not about protecting an abuser or some sort of perpetrator of violence against the child. It's not about a PTSD response occurring in someone who has experienced some kind of single traumatic event or ongoing systemic trauma. Those circumstances are identified during the differential diagnosis process, which also includes taking an extensive history from the patient themselves, as well as from their caregivers and loved ones. So what we're talking about here is actually a fear that is rooted in biology. It is a physiological response to an activation in a particular portion of the brain. And oftentimes, this is something that is being activated in the brain without any identifiable external cause. This is something that mental health practitioners have not generally been taught to look for, a biological symptom that may be changing as we speak, which is a fantastic turn of events. So when we learn about how to identify fear of harm, we do sort of have to stretch a little bit outside of our comfort zone. But when the disorder is present, it has real and dramatic effects. See, there is a subset of kids who tend to not respond to treatment. They are often described by parents and teachers and therapists and school counselors as complex kiddos. They often live in a constant state of fear of things like the dark, germs, animals, intruders. They often interpret neutral things in their environment, like being asked to put on their shoes, as threatening. And they tend to be hypervigilant, having high levels of separation anxiety, and they demonstrate defensive reactive aggression and often can't or have very significant difficulty making friends and maintaining friendships and maintaining relationships within the family unit. They often have horrific nightmares that traumatize them while they're asleep, and the imagery from those dreams haunts them during their waking life, making them feel unsafe and vulnerable. These complex kids tend to have a fairly poor prognosis because without improvement, they are at risk of being described as resistant to treatment or uncooperative patients. The language that we often use around this is that they have failed their treatment. And their parents are often described as being inconsistent or poor disciplinarians, which let me tell you, could not be further from the truth most of the time. But when providers don't see progress being made because the interventions that they're using don't work for this particular disorder, the providers and other adults and authority figures in the environment aren't recognizing. And so the truth is that they become convinced that the client would do better in treatment elsewhere. And so often they're referred to other providers and specialists, like to look for sensory sensitivity disorders, learning disabilities, speech and language pathologies, for specific behavior modification techniques and therapies. And as a result, these children wind up experiencing multiple assessments, redundant assessments, multiple different diagnoses given by different specialists who all recommend different types of treatment plans. These children are frequently hospitalized. Some even make attempts on their own life, and many wind up being disciplined at home or at school, or even arrested at school or in the community for having a heritable disorder that is biologically based, that they did not ask to have, and over which symptoms they have literally no control. Being able to identify, assess, and treat this disorder as early as possible is literally the difference between kids being able to live at home with their families versus being placed in long-term residential care facilities. It is the difference between having friends versus being isolated and being alone. It is literally the difference between life and death. So early identification and management of this illness spares children a lifetime of devastating and unrelenting symptoms, and it gives them back their childhood. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. So let's start at the beginning and how this disorder was first identified. Which brings us to our first learning objective for the evening, understanding how the FOH phenotype was first identified. So in 1999, a researcher and psychiatrist named Dr. Dimitri Popoulos published this book, along with his co-author Janice Popoulos, and it's called The Bipolar Child, which is currently in its third edition. It is one of the most sought-after books on bipolar disorder for parents who are struggling to find help for their children. Dr. Popoulos has been on these clinical seminars and webinars with me in the past, talking about bipolar disorder in children. I highly, highly recommend this book. It has an absolutely fantastic subtitle, The Definitive and Reassuring Guide to Childhood's Most Misunderstood Disorder. I love this subtitle because it acknowledges upfront that despite being misunderstood and often missed by providers, there is also hope because there are treatments that work. And as members of our parents community will tell you, there is hope on the other side of symptoms. But parents often have a hard time accessing that kind of treatment for their children because bipolar disorder in childhood is often misdiagnosed. The DSM does not list symptom criteria that is specific to how those symptoms present in children and in adolescents. It only lists adult symptoms. And while that's not the only reason for the confusion, as you may have seen in last month's clinical seminar on Can Kids Have Bipolar, but you've already heard a lot on that if you were at that seminar, and you can find that seminar on our YouTube channel and catch up if you weren't able to be there for it. But it's a significant hindrance to providers who have been trained to use the DSM as the authoritative source of diagnostic processes. So without that diagnostic criteria being specified in the DSM for childhood and adolescence presentation, providers often lack the confidence necessary to be able to make that diagnosis. FOH has a similar problem, but it's more significant in that there's no criteria in the DSM at all for it because it has not been submitted to the DSM committees for consideration yet. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, one of its hallmark symptoms is a biological symptom. And that's something that providers haven't been trained to associate with a mental health disorder or illness. And so, without a page number, without a diagnostic code in the DSM to refer to, clinicians tend to think that it doesn't exist at all, but it absolutely does. So again, the DSM, it has not been submitted to the DSM for publication yet, in part because it's too newly identified. To do the necessary research takes many, many years, oftentimes many years longer than most people realize. But in order to be presented to the DSM committees, extensive research and documentation needs to be done. And FOH was only first identified in 2005 or 2006. And so even the most recent, and this slide should have the DSM-5 TR, text revised edition, that was put out in, I believe it was 2022, but I could be wrong on that, so don't quote me. There's still been too much research that needs to be done on it. And so there's no way it could have made the cutoff. We are attempting to rectify that by supporting any and all research that is being done into FOH and sharing the fruits of that research as widely as possible. Now, the reason I mentioned Dr. Popolos's book earlier is that Dr. Popolos and his research team are the ones who first identified FOH, and they began publishing those findings, as I mentioned, back in 2005 and 2006. But the truth is they did not set out to find a new disorder when they were researching the causes of bipolar. It happened because that's where the data took them. They were actually looking to attempt to identify a cause of bipolar disorder in children and unearth more effective treatments for it. And as part of that, they were doing a genetics study where the team was looking, had developed a tool to collect and archive clinical profiles of thousands of children and adolescents who had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And so at that time, they had collected data on more than 5,300 children and adolescents. Those numbers have only grown in the ensuing years dramatically, and now there are well over 20,000 profiles in that database. And they were doing analyses of that data in order to come up with an understanding of how bipolar disorder symptoms uniquely present in children and what the severity of those symptoms tended to be. As part of that data analysis, they saw a new symptom profile emerging that involved a new set of symptoms that appeared to be coexisting with traditional bipolar disorder symptoms, those being mania, hypomania, and depressive episodes. So in this clinical sample, they were seeing high associations between fears that were exaggerated to extreme and debilitating proportions, and verbally and physically reactive, aggressive behaviors towards themselves and towards other people. So using the measurement tool that they had developed, the Child Bipolar Questionnaire, plus the Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale and the Overt Aggression Scale, these researchers were able to identify that children and adolescents were self-identifying, and their parents were confirming that they were experiencing aggressive obsessions, such as fear that they would harm themselves or others, or that something outside of their control would harm them or someone else, or that they'd act on these unwanted impulses and might unintentionally be responsible for something terrible happening. They also demonstrated aggressive behaviors that actually did cause harm to themselves and to others. Additionally, these children were reported to have made serious suicide threats, much more than those who scored lower on ratings of aggression and fear. So it was from these measurements that the researchers developed what they called the fear of harm index. And when they re-examined the data through the dimensional lens of the Y-box, OAS, and CBQ, questions of fear and aggression, they found that approximately 1/3 of the profiles showed no symptoms of fear of being harmed. 1/3 showed some symptoms of the fear of harm profile, and 1/3 showed nearly all of the identified symptoms of fear of harm. This also seems like a good moment to bring up again that it made perfect sense at the time that the researchers used the moniker of fear of harm for this illness, because it was the Y-box, OAS, and CBQ markers of fear of being harmed that led them down this path. Anyway, in addition to high levels of fear and aggression, researchers saw through clinical observations of these children and teens that they had a diurnal pattern to their mood cycling, with rapid cycles and mood shifts occurring in the late afternoon and evening each day. These diurnal mood changes were correlating each day with periods of temperature dysregulation that included overheating, torpor, sweating, and cold tolerance. These temperature disruptions were evidenced themselves through red flushed cheeks, through hot to the touch red ears, and was able to be identified as a disruption between the body's normal ratio between proximal and distal body temperatures through regular temperature taking on specific areas of the body at specific times of day over extended periods of time, where this pattern of temperature dysregulation was able to be identified and quantified. Clinical observations combined with these previous assessments that were done confirmed that the condition the researchers were uncovering was severe, and that children and adolescents with the disorder had higher rates of being held back in school, being suspended from school, higher rates of school phobias and school traumas, oppositional behaviors, misperceptions of the level of threat around them in their environment, had higher rates of psychiatric hospitalizations, and were more likely to have made credible threats of suicide or to have made suicide attempts. Those early clinical studies into fear of harm were published in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Affective Disorders and the Journal of Pediatrics. After years more study, they followed up those papers with a paper published in 2019 in the Journal of Psychiatry and Brain Science, in which they laid out what they had uncovered and established regarding connections between fears, aggression, and thermoregulatory disturbance. They also established this phenotype that they had identified as a new diagnosis, which they then called thermoregulatory fear of harm mood disorder. And they laid out in this paper FOH's diagnostic criteria. I will note that later this year, a new article is being published by Dr. Papalos and his team, and the new terminology being used to describe FOH is thermoregulatory sleep dysregulation disorder, and that article is forthcoming later this year in an internationally recognized psychiatry journal. So please stay tuned to our social media pages, our website, our newsletter, because we will be sharing information on this newest article published in 2025 as soon as it is available. So the diagnostic criteria for FOH was based on this early research and the fear of harm index, which was again based on the CBQ, the Y-BOX, and the OAS. And from that early data, the team developed what they called the 6 dimensions of the FOH phenotype. They later used these 6 dimensions as the basis for the development of the diagnostic criteria for FOH. And this grid is available on CMHRC's website, as well as on the website of the Juvenile Bipolar Research Foundation, who funded Dr. Popolos's research into FOH. And I frequently meet with parents who have found this and marked it up with pen or pencil, used it essentially as a checklist, and they're always astounded that they're finally seeing a list of their child's symptoms all together in one place under one umbrella. If you go to the CMHRC website and you look under the Programs and Services tab, at the bottom you'll see we have a bookshop. If you go to our bookshop, you will be able to get a book that we have written on FOH that actually includes literal checklists so that parents and providers can use it to understand the symptoms, to help rule in or rule out the fear of harm diagnosis. And it includes not only the information provided by researchers, but also a set of information community sourced from the families who live with fear of harm every single day. That is available as a digital download, which you can get immediately, or there are links on our bookshop to Amazon where you can get a paper copy of that book and others. Now, these 6 dimensions identified first what was called territorial aggression, which includes aggressive behaviors, irritable moods, intolerance of delays, defying or refusing to comply with rules or instructions, complex or simple. And it's important that the researchers identified it as territorial aggression and not some other form of aggression, because what they were trying to communicate with this terminology was that the aggression was fundamentally reactive. It was not proactive. It was a response to what was perceived to be threatening by those with the disorder. So these kids and teens and adults with this disorder weren't out there looking for a fight. They were not looking for an opportunity to be aggressive. This territorial aggression is coming out only when they were reacting to something in their environment that they perceived as threatening, or, as the case may be, something they misperceived as being threatening. So the next dimension was fear of harm to self or others, which is also a very severe symptom. In this dimension, the individual makes clear threats of violence to self, has made clear threats of suicide, may be fascinated with blood, gore, violent imagery when there doesn't seem to be any justification for their fixation. And this dimension has been used by some to promote and encourage a stigma against those with FOH and to attempt to paint them as dangerous or violent, which is really truly shameful, because it really truly misses the point here, which is that just like with the first dimension of territorial aggression, these factors only come out when the individual feels threatened or is in the throes of a deep, depressive, or manic episode. The next dimension shows extremely high levels of anxiety, specifically excessive amounts of distress when separated from family. In particular, at this point in the research, it was demonstrated that it was primarily the mother or primary caregiver. This pervasive anxiety contributes to something we'll talk about later when we talk about misdiagnosis. The fourth dimension focuses on self-esteem, and during periods that most clinicians would identify as being depressive episodes, the kids would complain of being bored, but this was not usual childhood boredom. This boredom evoked high levels of anxiety, self-doubt, and crushingly low levels of self-esteem. A parent saying that they couldn't read a book with a child, or a friend being unavailable to come to play, would induce feelings of extreme rejection, humiliation, and shame so profound that the children would either lash out or lose the ability to find pleasure in any activity. The fifth dimension included high levels of cravings for sweets, hoarding, nightmares, and night terrors, which were eventually moved to their own category of sleep disruptions, which we'll get into later, and parasomnias, like bedwetting, that goes beyond the expected developmental period where bedwetting can happen. Eventually, the researchers recategorized many of these items under the heading of sleep disruptions, which is actually the final dimension. So the dimension of sleep arousal problems, which will be lumped together with thermodysregulation issues here and eventually separated out into two categories, show incredible difficulty falling asleep at night, staying asleep, and waking up properly in the morning, all of which has been triggered by the temperature dysregulation. So now that we've looked at how the phenotype was first identified, we're going to move on to our second learning objective for the evening, which is understanding FOH's symptoms and how they present. So the 6 dimensions were first identified and established during the early research stages of FOH, and eventually became the basis for the diagnostic criteria for FOH that was developed by Dr. Papalos and his team. And after additional research and organization of the dimensions, the team settled on 7 specific criteria for diagnosing. And now the interesting thing about the diagnostic criteria for FOH is that in order to be diagnosed with FOH, you have to have all of the first 6 criteria met. As we clinicians know, the DSM criteria for disorders doesn't work that way usually. Usually it's you need to have 5 out of 8 or 6 out of 10, or in the case of some disorders, 1 diagnostic criteria present and documented. The difference here is that with FOH, you have to have all of the first 6. And one of the only reasons that the final criteria is not included in that is because that is the identification of a family history, and that is not always possible. The family history may exist, but it may not be accessible to the patient or their caregivers, and so it is the only one that is not required for diagnosis. So now, I should mention that makes it easier to rule in and rule out, because if you have all but 2, then you know that it is not this diagnosis, it's something else. And so it does make ruling in or ruling out FOH easier than people may initially suspect. Now, we're going to go into detail on each of these diagnostic criteria, starting with episodic and abrupt transitions in mood states. Typically, this is characterized by episodic and abrupt transitions in mood states, as it says, that include rapid alterations in levels of arousal, emotional excitability, sensory sensitivity, and motor activity. The way the researchers identified this was to say that to meet the first criteria for FOH, you must also meet the criteria for any form of bipolar disorder: bipolar disorder 1, bipolar disorder 2, mixed episode, major depression with some short-term mania, major depression with perhaps insufficient criteria for hypomania, cyclothymia, what used to be called dysthymia. These episodes have to have occurred. So a lot of times people will say, well, can't FOH exist without bipolar disorder? And the answer as of now, based on the research we have at this point, the answer is no. The first diagnostic criteria for FOH is the presence of a mood disruption and any form of bipolar disorder. I see your question in the Q&A, and we promise to get to it. The next is that with this episodic and abrupt transition in mood state, you are seeing rapid and unexpected mood swings, which includes several factors. The first of which is that, and this is one of the pieces that can be confusing for providers, is that mood changes are happening multiple times a day. These mood swings are happening frequently without warning. There's no observable trigger, and their energy is ramping up as the day is winding down. This is that diurnal pattern of hypomania and mania in the late afternoon and evening that the researchers originally saw emerge out of that initial study. These mood changes are happening multiple times a day, in part because of the temperature dysregulation, which is diurnal, and the influence that temperature dysregulation has on mood. They can occur at any time. The mood changes between depression and hypomania and mania can happen multiple times a day, which we'll talk about later, contributes to misdiagnosis. Now, the next factor is a mood state of a mood state is depression, which includes feelings of sadness, irritability, loss of interest in things that they found enjoyable, feelings of acute and irreconcilable boredom, feelings of worthlessness, and feelings of helplessness. Mood swings also include episodes of mania or hypomania, which include racing thoughts, irritability in children, intensely goal-driven behavior, which we refer to as mission mode, and grandiosity. Again, in our Can Kids Have Bipolar Disorder seminar, we covered what all of these look like in children and how to differentiate them from the adult symptomology. So if you are curious about how grandiosity presents in children, I highly recommend you go seek out our YouTube channel and look at last month's clinical seminar on Can Kids Have Bipolar Disorder. The second major symptom of FOH is that fear of harm symptom, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's intense and debilitating fear that they or someone that they love will be harmed. And it's usually in some terrifying way: a bridge collapse, a building collapse, wild animals attacking, being attacked by intruders in gruesome ways. This is part of how we know this goes beyond sort of what we would consider expected childhood fears. They leave the child with FOH on constant alert, looking for threats in the environment that they're convinced are there waiting to harm them. And unfortunately, they are also, as a result of this heightened hypervigilance, misperceiving experiences that are actually neutral, such as tone of voice or facial expression that is actually neutral, and they are experiencing it as threatening. An fMRI study that was done several years ago out of McLean Hospital at Harvard University Medical School, along with JBRF and Dr. Popoulos, showed in a functional MRI that when shown faces that were either happy, neutral, or threatening, those with FOH perceived both the threatening and the neutral faces as threatening. So there's a misperception when neutral tones, neutral facial expressions are being used. This constant state of fear leads to obsessive bedtime rituals, fear of the dark, of intruders, of the other things I listed earlier, high levels of separation anxiety, contamination fears, hypervigilance, and a limited ability for the child to function normally at school, at home, and in the community. These symptoms are often what is mistaken for either oppositional and defiant behaviors and or obsessive compulsive behaviors and or anxiety-driven behaviors. Yes, they are anxiety-based, but they are based in something that is different from your generalized anxiety disorder. These symptoms hit at school, at home, and in the community, disrupting the child's ability to function in an expected way. Again, I just want to reiterate here, as I said at the beginning, that when we are talking about this fear of harm symptom, as clinicians and diagnosticians, we do need to do an extensive differential diagnosis process. We must take a thorough history. We must make absolutely sure that these fears of the child or teen or adult, that what they are experiencing are not the results of some sort of external trauma or unsafe environment. There are aspects of FOH that are legitimately traumatizing in and of themselves, such as the gory, violent nightmares that we'll talk about in a little more detail shortly. Researchers have termed this trauma that comes from the symptoms themselves as auto-traumatization. It is differentiated from externally imposed trauma. But once we have established to a reasonable degree that the fears are not based on an external identifiable experience, we can recognize them as being symptoms of fear of harm. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, we are not determining that these fears are unfounded because either adults are dismissing the legitimate fears of children and teens, or that we're gaslighting somebody into doubting their perceptions, denying their experience. This isn't about an abuser being protected from the consequences of their perpetration of violence. It's not PTSD in response to some other external event. And we are also not determining that these fears are unfounded just because someone else wouldn't consider them to be debilitating. The fears are founded because they are being experienced by the individual with the disorder. I'm going to give you a few real life examples of these types of fears to concretize it for you and give you context for what folks with this disorder are actually experiencing. All right, some real life examples. They include a child who will not leave the house because bees exist. Whether or not they have ever seen a bee, whether or not it is a winter and bees are all hibernating, they become completely dysregulated if forced to go outside, even when there is evidence that there are no bees nearby. A second one would be a teen who has never had a food allergy, never had an episode of food poisoning, who will not try any new foods, even milkshakes or new flavors of ice cream, because they are afraid that that new food could be poisonous and that they would die. This is not the same as having avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, ARFID. This is about a fear that trying something new could cause them significant harm. Then another example is a tween who, without any trauma history or history of abuse, becomes terrified to the point of an acute anxiety attack that they will never see their parent again anytime their mother or father leaves the house. I also want to point out that these are not to be considered non-bizarre delusions. These aren't false beliefs that are held. Rather, they are acute and terrifying fears of what might happen. Also, part of the fear of harm symptom are the distorted reactions that kids have to normal stimuli in their environment. People with FOH are experiencing their fight, flight, freeze response being triggered when there aren't any environmental threats that require it. Children with FOH see threats that don't exist, either by misperceiving something neutral in their environment as threatening, everything as simple as setting a minor limit or a correction or redirection to having to hear the word no, can be misperceived as a direct threat. Loss is also something that results in the fight, flight, freeze response being triggered, and aggressive and reactive responses that seem to outsiders as disproportionate to the situation are also being triggered by this pervasive fear of being harmed. These misperceived threats can also be triggered by feeling excessively defensive as a result of being embarrassed, misunderstood, unheard, humiliated, dismissed, or rejected. But seeing fear and threats where they don't exist truly plagues individuals who have the FOH diagnosis, and that it encourages their fears and perceptions of danger in a cyclical way. You can also see these emotional reactions reflected in the diagnostic criteria that can be selected in order to confirm the presence of the symptom, including self-consciousness, feeling humiliated, obsessive fears of harm, and misjudged levels of threat. The next criteria is thermoregulatory disturbance. Here we have what may actually be the more important of the hallmark symptoms in the diagnostic criteria list. And we'll get to the details on the criteria in a moment, but we have to stop to acknowledge that it's even more important than the fear of harm for two reasons. First, because it's biological. It is a physiological symptom, not a psychiatric one. This has never been documented before in association with a psychiatric disorder, so it's hugely important. This second reason it's perhaps more important than the fear of harm symptom is that it is the biological feature that triggers the fear response, the hypervigilance, the fight, flight, freeze response, as well as triggering the aggressive behaviors and the sleep disruptions. The temperature dysregulation is what we call a biomarker or biological marker. And later this year, we are going to have a clinical seminar that just takes a deep dive into the biological marker and how it's treated and identified. I think that's next month in May. I could be wrong. Please check our website, cmhrc.org/webinars or cmhrc.org/clinical seminar in order to find our upcoming schedule, or you can just go to the main website, cmhrc.org, and look under the free resources tab for those page links. FOH is the first psychiatric disorder with a biological marker of this kind. That means there's a physical symptom from which the other symptoms flow. Treating the biological symptom helps control the other symptoms, which are inaccurately identified and characterized as behavioral symptoms. Behavioral implies intention. It implies voluntary choice to engage in those behaviors. They are not. They are biologically triggered by temperature dysregulation. And when we understand this, we can help the patient stabilize and manage their mood and behavior much more easily because we are addressing it at its cause, which is temperature dysregulation. So what does this temperature dysregulation look like? Again, we're going to do a deep dive in this next time, but for today, we'll sort of give a Reader's Digest summary version to say that temperature dysregulation can simply be understood as the brain's inability to regulate body temperature properly and to stabilize and maintain appropriate body temperature. It is measured in the body's inability to dispel generated heat appropriately. And when the body overheats, it drives the other symptoms of FOH that have been misperceived as behavioral. And it also causes the sleep-wake disturbances. Most of the observable features that parents and family members and teachers are likely to report associated with the temperature dysregulation is that folks with FOH feel hot, become hot and sweaty when the climate around them does not call for it, like in neutral room temperatures, but it doesn't feel so neutral to them. They also have a disruption in the normal temperature rhythms of the body, which has the body cool down in the evening to prepare for sleep and warm up in the morning to prepare for the day ahead. This FOH, this cycle is reversed, and folks feel hot in the evening when they are supposed to be cooling down, sometimes excessively so. And in the morning, they are cold, often unable to get out of bed or out from under the covers. Some telltale signs of temperature dysregulation are, as I mentioned, bright red ears that are often warm or hot to the touch, which is caused by the body trying to get rid of that excess heat that's building up in the core of the body. Other identifiable associations with temperature disruption include a refusal to wear weather appropriate clothing. For example, wearing shorts and tank tops and flip-flops in colder winter temperatures, or refusing to wear a coat when it is literally freezing outside, and experiencing little to no discomfort at all when exposed to that cold air. Now, the most important aspect of this symptom of thermoregulatory disturbance, as I mentioned earlier, is that it is a trigger for the other FOH symptoms, including the exaggerated fears, aggressive behaviors, and the sleep disruptions, including parasomnias, which we're going to be talking about next. And there is a biological reason temperature dysregulation causes these other symptoms to occur. And it really is very important when you're treating this single symptom, because it can have the effect of putting the other symptoms into remission too, which quite frankly is downright remarkable, especially when you see it firsthand. But again, this is just a quick overview of the biomarker of temperature dysregulation. We're going to get into it in more detail in subsequent clinical seminars. Really do encourage you to register for that. The next symptom of FOH is the sleep-wake disturbances. Children with FOH tend to start displaying sleep disruptions as early as infancy. Many parents report that their children never slept properly, even as babies. Some didn't develop the ability to sleep through the night until after they started treatment for FOH. And for many people, that's not until the children are in their tweens and teen years. But we're able to identify these sleep-wake disturbances in three primary ways. Sleep cycle disruptions, which includes things like sleepwalking, sleep talking, teeth grinding, bedwetting. These are known as parasomnias. The second is through chronic and persistent, pervasive nightmares and night terrors. These nightmares are filled, as I've mentioned, with violent, often gory imagery involving themes of pursuit and abandonment, scenarios in which they or their loved ones are being maimed or killed. These images linger with the individual long after they awaken and often plague them throughout the day through intrusive involuntary thoughts, and the imagery persisting as involuntary imagery when they close their eyes or whenever they have a quiet moment without external stimulation to distract them, which leads to severe boredom intolerance. Now, while nightmares are consciously remembered after waking up, night terrors, on the other hand, most often aren't. And the night terrors can be just as traumatic because during a night terror, the body and brain are reacting as though what's happening in the dream is really happening, and it creates trauma in the brain. Night terrors are also traumatic for parents and family members who witness them, because oftentimes during a night terror, the individual appears to be awake, is walking, talking, screaming, crying, trying to get away from the threat while screaming for help. Children often cry out for their parents, begging for help, while simultaneously pushing their parents away and recoiling in fear from the night terror imagery they are being subjected to. And while the child will most likely not consciously remember the night terror in the morning, as a parent, if you have been awake through your child's night terror, you will certainly remember, and it will impact parents significantly. The third sleep disturbance is alterations in circadian rhythms, which are easy to spot. FOH patients have a very difficult time winding down in the evening and preparing to go to bed. While most people are starting to feel tired out from their day, those with FOH are having their body temperature and energy levels ramp up, and they find themselves wide awake and unable to settle down just as sleep is supposed to be setting in. This makes bedtime routines incredibly difficult for parents and their kids, because the child is experiencing a combination of rising energy levels, anticipatory dread about having to go to sleep and experience nightmares, and their circadian rhythms are off, telling them that it isn't time to go to sleep. These circadian rhythms difficulties also include difficulty waking in the morning, being excessively restless during the night with frequent awakenings in the night for trips to the bathroom, and you'll often find bed sheets in disarray, pillows on the floor, the child sleeping upside down or sideways on the bed. In the morning, their circadian rhythms are further disruptive by making it difficult for them to wake up. They experience what's called sleep inertia. Just as they should be waking up, their body is finally and brain is finally falling into a deep restorative sleep, and it is so deep that they cannot wake up and get out of bed. These folks have difficulty getting to school, getting to work, getting to their commitments on time as a result, and most often they are accused of doing it on purpose as a delay tactic, as an avoidance strategy, when in reality, they are literally unable to wake up because their brain is telling them that it is time to be asleep. And when you're in a battle of wills between a parent and the child's neurological functioning, the neurological functioning is going to win out. Now, the next symptom is aggression. The criteria here again focuses on reactive and territorial aggression that is in a response to something in the environment, such as a perceived threat or loss, including aggressive fight-based speech or actions, or self-directed aggression, such as headbanging or cutting or scratching behaviors. These behaviors can be difficult to differentiate from either expected early childhood behaviors, such as tantrums, or from other diagnoses that may have already been made, such as conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. It's considered developmentally expected for a toddler to have a tantrum over either rational or irrational setbacks. Those tantrums usually last a few minutes. A few may last as long as an hour, but in non-diagnosable cases, those tantrums that are longer like that are considered rare. We can look at some specific factors to help us identify non-developmentally expected aggression. So in a child with FOH, tantrums last upwards of 30, 60, or 90 minutes nearly every time. They are also accompanied by physical and verbal aggression. Parents know when their child's tantrums are not falling within the spectrum of what is expected developmentally. They know what expected outbursts look like. Oftentimes, these parents have other children who don't have FOH, so they know what developmentally expected outbursts look like. And when they don't have other children, they've encountered other children. They have seen nieces and nephews, cousins, siblings of theirs when they were younger, uh, the children of their friends. They know what it looks like. So when you have a parent come to you and say, there is something off about my child's tantrums, one of the first things that we encourage practitioners to do is to believe those parents and not dismiss it as something that is developmentally expected. Now, aggression can also be shown in non-tantrum related ways, such as defiant and oppositional behavior, refusals to follow simple instructions, complete expected tasks, and engage in basic chores such as hygiene, completing homework, getting dressed, getting themselves something to eat. These requests can be met with verbally and physically aggressive responses from the child that can then escalate into tantrums. This leaves parents and siblings and teachers and classmates and friends and anyone who that child interacts with feeling as though they're walking on eggshells all of the time and never really knowing which interactions are going to be fraught with this potential for aggression. These resistant behaviors and tantrums, they continue well past expected ages and leave families feeling burned out and truly exhausted. Physical aggression during these tantrums routinely involves attacks on people, on property, throwing things, slamming doors, putting holes in walls, kicking, biting, hitting, scratching, and all the rest. Verbal aggression includes things like cursing, verbal cruelty, verbal threats to self and others, voicing suicidal ideation or homicidal ideation. And generally, again, parents know what is an expected form of verbal outburst opposed to this verbal aggression, which is symptomatic. It is important for us to remind ourselves yet again that the symptom of aggression does not make someone inherently dangerous. Those who live with FOH are not chronically irritable. They are not chronically angry. Having a mental illness does not automatically make somebody a danger to themselves or to others. In fact, after an outburst, those who have fear of harm express tremendous remorse, regret, guilt, and shame that they did and said some of the things that they did and said. They don't want to engage in those behaviors. They feel totally overwhelmed by these involuntary symptoms that forces them to act in ways that are genuinely out of character. One child with FOH described it as feeling as though they were trapped inside of a cage, inside of themselves, watching a monster take control of their mouth and their body to do and say things that they would never agree to do. They feel helpless, they feel confused, and they themselves are terrified by these outbursts. Sometimes they don't even remember what happened during the outbursts, and they live in fear that they are going to happen again and that they won't be able to stop it because they don't know what's causing it and they don't have any control. This can be a really hard thing for folks who are on the outside observing to believe because behaviors appear, or I should say actions appear as intentional behaviors, but they are actually symptomatic, involuntary responses to their physiologically based illness. All right, the next item on the diagnostic criteria list is that symptoms are not due to a general medical condition. This is standard operating procedure for all diagnostic criteria. We have to make sure that the symptoms of FOH aren't being actually caused by some kind of other illness or general medical condition. For example, this person isn't hot because they have a fever. They're not having trouble sleeping because they have sleep apnea. They are not having mood dips because they have low blood sugar associated with type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes. So we rule out these other general medical conditions and other diagnoses. Since the fear of harm criteria overlaps with that of other DSM diagnoses, and frankly, all DSM diagnoses have overlap with something else, it is extremely important that we as clinicians do a rigorous differential diagnosis process to examine, consider, and rule out other causes for the presenting symptoms. And it is only through this differential diagnosis process that we can truly be confident that we have the correct diagnosis. The last item here is that there's a family history of recurrent mood disorder. This perhaps is the simplest criteria to explain because we all understand that certain traits and conditions are passed from parent to child or within certain families within their genes. And this means that illnesses, as I said, run in families. Everything from green eyes to breast cancer to a predisposition towards depression can be inherited, and the same is true in the case of FOH. Close family members, parents, siblings, grandparents, blood relations have mood disorders, bipolar disorder, or even addictions like alcoholism or substance abuse. It increases the likelihood that the diagnosis of FOH is correct. Okay. So far, we have looked at understanding how the FOH phenotype was identified and what its symptoms are, and now we're going to understand how to differentiate FOH from other diagnoses. It's actually easier to do than most people think for three simple reasons. And I talked about the importance of the differential diagnosis in this process. But first, unlike other diagnoses in the DSM, as I mentioned earlier, FOH requires that the first 6 criteria all be met, and not a certain percentage. This means you're not picking and choosing amongst many symptoms to cobble together a diagnosis. Either they meet all of those first 6 symptoms or they don't. Second, the FOH diagnostic criteria clearly states that an individual must meet the DSM-5 criteria for any diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So again, acknowledging that there's still some confusion about how to diagnose that in children. Our clinical seminar on that topic is very helpful. You can get a copy of it to watch on YouTube. You can also get a copy of our book on bipolar disorder and how it presents in children, which contains checklists and information that will help determine if that diagnosis is applicable or not in our bookshop. Here's a list of the various things that we have on our YouTube channel and on our bookshop that can help with this. But once bipolar disorder has been established or not, you know whether or not the first criteria of fear of harm has been met or not. And lastly, and most importantly, FOH's distinguishing and most identifiable characteristic is the presence of thermoregulatory disturbance in combination with the other psychological and physical symptoms. In short, thermodysregulation is the thing that we use to differentiate FOH from other disorders. Temperature dysregulation, without it, even with the other symptoms present, it's probably not going to be FOH. With thermodysregulation in combination with all the other symptoms, then we know it probably is FOH. The good thing about this disorder is that once we're able to identify that the temperature dysregulation is present, we can treat it, causing all those other symptoms it was triggering to either diminish and become manageable, or to even go into full remission. Which brings us to our fourth learning objective: understand the identified treatments. Treatment of FOH actually begins with lifestyle interventions that they are, for the most part, highly effective, cost-free, and simple to implement. They require no prescription. They require no medicinal intervention. They can be started immediately at home with extremely low risk. These interventions include strategies to help the body release built up heat, maintain an appropriate body temperature, and reset circadian rhythms. We are going to have an upcoming seminar all about how to use these strategies extensively as a direct treatment for FOH. So again, check out our webinars and clinical seminars pages on our website for more information on when those are happening. Once a parent or a patient or a family tries these interventions, they're going to see relatively quickly if they're helpful or not. Then they can decide whether or not that help is sufficient to be a standalone intervention, or whether it has only resulted in moderate improvements and medicinal interventions are still required. We do talk about treatment for any mental health disorder as being a three-legged stool, with all three pieces to treatment being necessary for truly successful treatment. The first piece of that for FOH is going to be these lifestyle interventions. They are powerful, they are effective, but they don't usually function as the sole treatment. And so the next component of treatment for FOH is psychotherapy. In regards to bipolar and FOH, not all therapies are created equal. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which is extremely popular as an evidence-based treatment, is not particularly effective when it comes to FOH and bipolar disorder, especially in children who are symptomatic, because the fact that they are struggling with their fight, flight, freeze instinct and this physiological disruption to their body temperature and their circadian rhythms means that it is nearly impossible for them to implement any CBT strategies or skills when their brain is dysregulated. When they are flooded with stress hormones, no matter how well they have learned those skills, they are not going to be able to access them. I always say that if you were being chased by an angry, hungry bear, the idea that you would get a sticker or a piece of paper as a reward at some future time is not going to be sufficient to stop you from running away from the bear. Would not be a motivator of any kind. That's exactly what these kids are feeling and they're facing when they are experiencing a complex physiological process that is resulting in them truly believing that they're facing an existential threat. It is much more effective to use therapy strategies that help them identify when their body's getting hot, when they are starting to get overheated, when they are starting to feel dissociated, and to intervene with strategies that are concrete, like that help their body dispel heat. And that is going to be much more effective. Additionally, it's really hard to learn skills from someone you don't trust. And so kids in particular who have FOH and bipolar disorder, the traditional kind, have a very hard time trusting adults. Honestly, I can't blame them for that. When they spend a large portion of their lives, being told no, being told they're wrong, being disciplined for things that they don't have any control over, being disbelieved when they try to explain what was causing the actions that the adults observed, and really being told over and over again that they need to learn how to control involuntary symptoms. So it's why with providers in psychotherapy, it's extremely important to just focus on rapport building, person-centered treatment that is focused on mindfulness, DBT strategies. And when we talk about rapport building, we are talking about an extended rapport building phase during which those person-centered strategies are put into place. Providers expect to spend 2 to 3 times the normal length of time that you spend in rapport and relationship building for a kid or teen who has FOH. We're looking at 6 to 12 months sometimes of rapport building before you can get down to the more traditional aspects of psychotherapy. The final leg of this three-legged stool is medication that assists the body with managing mood stabilization, with controlling body temperature, and managing body temperature regulation. The right medications can help the brain, help the brain's temperature controls, thereby reducing or eliminating the other FOH symptoms. Now, we know that many people are opposed to prescribing psychiatric medications for children, but with a biological, physiological cause of the disorder, it's difficult to treat, put it into remission either partially or fully without the use of some prescription medications. But the good part is that there are medications that have been used safely in children and adolescents that can be used to ease the temperature dysregulation and release that built up body heat. At this point in our program, we have addressed our 4 learning objectives. However, I will say that this is a newly identified disorder with research into it that is continuing literally as we speak. There is, simply put, so much more than we could possibly put into a single clinical seminar of 90 minutes. And in just a moment, we're going to use the time left for an open Q&A, but I do want to share a couple of pieces of information first. We do have a number of services that we offer to bring people into our community, to be truly active members in our community. You can participate in our monthly professional discussion groups. You can watch things from our educational webinar and clinical seminar archives on YouTube. You can make a gift, as I mentioned earlier, which is extremely important in allowing us to be able to dedicate the time necessary to do rigorously researched presentations for the general public and leave them at free of charge. These are the works that we have cited in today's presentation. You can get a copy of this slideshow from the presentation, which includes all of these works cited, and all of these underlined pieces are hyperlinks to take you directly to the research that was used to create today's presentation. By requesting the slideshow for your personal use for a $25 preparation fee. That preparation fee, as I said, goes to support all of our programs and services and to keep this program free and accessible to everyone. If you need a certificate of completion and you've attended the live event, you can also get a certificate of completion by requesting one through the link that will come to you tomorrow from Zoom confirming that you attended. If again you're watching this on a recording, please consider attending our live events. You will have access to the Q&A, and you will also have access to those certificates of completion. And lastly, I want to remind everyone that this year in 2025, our year-long fundraiser of Give 25 in 25 is running. You can use this QR code to make a gift on our safe and secure fundraising platform, or go to cmhrc.org/donate and make a gift.